Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Pascaline Dupas. I'm an economist here at Stanford, the Kleinheinz Family Professor in International Studies, and the Faculty Director of the King Center on Global Development. Before we jump into the topic for today, I want to share a little about the King Center. Our goal here at the King Center is to contribute towards global poverty alleviation. We do this by supporting global development research by faculty, by postdocs, by students, research that aims to inform policy and practice on critical development issues. We also do this by helping train the next generation of thinkers and leaders. And finally, we do this by hosting conversations about current issues, to take stock of the state of affairs, the state of knowledge, and to help identify the gaps where efforts should be focused in the years ahead. Which brings us to our conversation for today. We will be discussing the state of learning and education systems in the global south, with a focus on how to build back after the disruptions caused by the ongoing COVID pandemic. Today's discussion is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the King Center's website early next week. So let me introduce the two experts who will be conversing with us today. Our first speaker is David Evans, a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. I've known Dave for just about 20 years. We worked together on some education projects in Kenya a long time ago, and I've really admired his work ever since. Prior to joining the CGD, Dave was at the World Bank for over a decade, where he worked on evaluations of education, early childhood development, agriculture, health, and social safety net programs in many countries, both in Latin America and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in 2018, he co-authored the influential World Development Report titled Learning to Realize Education's Promise. Our second speaker is Nompumelelo Mohohlwane from the Department of Basic Education in South Africa. Nompumelelo is an education researcher working as a deputy director in the Research Coordination, Monitoring and Evaluation Directorate at the National Department of Basic Education. Our unit is responsible for system monitoring, supporting performance information management, and conducting research and evaluation of education interventions. Our research in the past year has focused on the impact of the coronavirus on learning in South Africa, and she's also leading a big effort to identify successful interventions to boost early grade reading. So thank you so much, Dave and Nompumelelo, for being here with us today. We are extremely pleased to have you. Each of you will share opening remarks, and then we'll start our discussion. Thanks to everyone in the audience who shared questions when they registered. If you have questions that come to you live, please use the Q&A feature, and then we will ask these questions during the discussion. So thanks again, everyone. Let's get started. Dave, the floor is yours.
It is a great pleasure to be here to be talking about such an important topic. So the context of education policy as we look at the COVID crisis, where we are now and where we need to go from here. So I'll give a big picture view, and then I'll pass it to Mpumi, who will give a much closer view from the ground in South Africa. But so, where are we at with education policy and the COVID crisis? It's important to recognize the profound disruption that COVID has had for education. Many of us who are based in high-income countries have experienced a significant shock to education, and honestly, I think it is almost nothing compared to what we've seen in low and middle income countries. And so, for example, if you look across the world, in many countries of the world, children had less than 10 weeks of school in the first 12 months of the crisis, right? So from March of 2020 to March of 2021, you can see the dark blue countries on this map are countries where nationwide you had between 1 and 10 weeks of in-person school over the course of the crisis. And there are many countries that had, some more, but that missed at least half of a year of schooling. So dramatic impacts. Now, one of the things that's important about this is that children in some countries are expected over the course of their lives to experience much less schooling than others. And so if we scale this by the proportion of the total expected schooling that children are expected to gain over the course of their lives, what we can see is that some children have lost as much as a sixth of their total expected schooling in the context of the COVID crisis. So a few of the highest hitting countries in South Sudan, the students have lost 16% of their expected lifetime schooling. In Sudan, it's 12%, but it's not limited to Sub-Saharan Africa. We have, Pakistan with 10%, Honduras with 9%, and other countries going down the line. So this is not, just some, modest shock that children have experienced, and we can necessarily expect them to bounce back. This is a major proportion of the entire educational experience that we would expect them to have over the course of their lives. Now we might say, oh, well, yeah, but what about education technology, right? This was supposed to be the moment for education technology. Well, that just hasn't ended up being the case. And honestly, it shouldn't have been hard to predict. So the vast majority of countries in the world have implemented some sort of distance learning. And so you can see in the map on the left that, and this is some work from the Center for Global Development Education Tracker, you can see that, lots of countries had some sort of online learning. That's the dark green or aqua. And then there are fewer countries, especially concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, where you just had TV and radio options, and only a tiny handful of countries where there was really no distance learning on the table. But that said, even though you have all these countries that have distance learning, and many of them, including poor countries, low-income countries that have some sort of online learning, access to online learning is extremely limited. So from this figure that was prepared by Garcia Escribano, you can see where people have access to the internet. And so the countries that are red or orange or yellow are countries where relatively few people have access to the internet. So when we talk about, oh, great, we have an online learning program in a lower middle income country, but you have only a tiny fraction of the population that actually has access to the internet. What that means is that you have a learning program that is only catering, while schools are closed, to the very best off students, to the richest students, those who honestly, even without a serious intervention, whose parents would probably be investing in other ways of making sure that their kids keep up. Now, okay, well, you say, well, maybe they don't have access to the internet, but what about other forms of technology? So in a number of countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, pardon the typo, Sierra Leone, others, there were television programs broadcast that taught lessons. And, we do have evidence on the effectiveness of TV. So certainly, we have a lot of evidence that Sesame Street has been really effective at boosting learning. So the distance learning programs that have been broadcast in low and lower middle income countries are not like Sesame Street, right? In the sense that these were put together very quickly, and these are essentially just teachers teaching lessons, but without the opportunity of students to engage or to call on students, all the things that actually make education effective. Not only that, even within the context of that relatively lower quality distance education, you can see, so this is evidence from Pakistan, and what you can see here is if we compare students based on their parents' level of education on the left-hand figure, you can see children who had uneducated parents. If you look at the yellow circle, that's after 3 months of school closure, how likely they were to be watching teleschool. And if you look at students on the right-hand side whose parents had, secondary or more education, you can see, a sizable difference. And that for the poorest students, over the time, going from 3 months to 6 months, their probability of watching these telelessons actually dropped. Whereas for richer students, their probability actually increased over time. So these telelessons, if anything, increased gaps in learning. And we can see similar patterns in wealth going from the poorest to the richest students and their likelihood of participating in this teleschool. So some work that Kumar Biswas and others, including me, did in Bangladesh found similar issues that, less than half of students, even among students these are students who were targeted for scholarships before the program, less than half of them had access to any television, and only 40% had access to the channel that had the government distributed education programs. Now, a number of countries and non-government organizations and private organizations made efforts to improve the effectiveness of this education technology. So in Botswana, Bangladesh, Kenya, and Sierra Leone, having teachers call students and provide tutoring to supplement the television programs. Honestly, those impacts have been very inconsistent across places, and we still need time to figure out exactly why things worked in Botswana and Bangladesh They didn't work in Kenya and Sierra Leone, but clearly just bringing in that human element, the teachers, isn't enough to consistently close the gap that we get from trying to use education technology while schools are closed. Okay, so what happened? So in the, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of concern. People looked at dropout rates in Sierra Leone from the Ebola crisis because it's a place where there was data and schools were closed for an extended period. And you had adolescent girls especially dropping out at very high rates in Sierra Leone during that crisis. Now, if we look at dropout rates now that many schools in many countries have reopened, what do they look like? What you can see across countries is that on average, dropout rates have, they haven't been enormous. You haven't had 50% of kids dropping out. So in the Philippines, 96% of basic education learners. In Pakistan, 86% of children in the Citizens Foundation, so a major provider of education, with higher re-enrollment for girls. In Ethiopia, 87% re-enrollment at primary age. In South Africa, you can see a similar. In Sierra Leone, almost all the children had returned to school as of late 2020. In Ghana, you see some interesting patterns. It's very high re-enrollment on average, 98%. But at the end of key education cycles, so at the end of the primary cycle, it's 95%, so a bit lower. And at the end of the lower secondary cycle, it's only 92%. So on average, while those seem like relatively high numbers, what that does mean is that in a number of countries, especially, Pakistan, Ethiopia, South Africa, and, as we get to the older grades in Ghana, you have anywhere between 8 and 15% of students who aren't coming back, students who probably would have continued their education, but as a result of being out of school for an extended period of time, aren't coming back. That's an important number of students as we think about trying to make sure that every student gets a full and quality education. What about learning? So, from the outset, there have been a lot of simulations on, how much learning loss based on what we know about, how much learning students lose while schools are closed for summer vacations or other holidays. So here's one version of these simulations that comes from the World Bank, looking at learning poverty. So, which is the question of whether a child is in school and able to read an age-appropriate text by the age of 10. And from these World Bank simulations, what you can see is that there's about a 10 percentage point increase in children due to COVID who are in learning poverty, who are either not in school or they're in school but they're not learning to read. And you can see that's the yellow figures there on the right. These are these additional kids. Now, the biggest increases in learning poverty happen in South Asia, Latin America, and East Asia and the Pacific from these simulations. But an important thing to remember is that doesn't mean that, for example, students in sub-Saharan Africa aren't experiencing reductions in learning, and we'll see more on that in a second. What it means instead is that so many of those students were already in learning poverty. They already weren't achieving age-appropriate reading levels by age 10, that doesn't actually increase the learning poverty rates. So now that a lot of kids are coming back to school and more countries are resuming some sort of test or exam, we're actually able to move beyond simulations and get a sense, country by country, of how much learning has actually been lost. So I'm going to say something about high-income countries, even though that's not the focus of the event. And the reason is that since we don't have data on all the low-income, and lower middle-income countries that we might want data on yet at this point, seeing what's happening in high-income countries where you have all of this, access to online learning and, sort of computers and often interactive, via Zoom or Google Classroom, the learning that we see there, we could think of as an upper bound relative to what we might see in other environments. So in Belgium, we see math scores dropping by almost 0.2 standard deviations. But what we also see, and this is a pattern we'll see repeated again and again, is that within school inequality is rising dramatically, and so is inequality across schools. So the story here is not just about learning loss, but it's about who's learning loss. And over again, we see that it's the most vulnerable students. So in Netherlands, primary test scores fell down about 0.08 standard deviations, a much smaller impact, but losses were 60% larger for students from less educated homes. Just brand new data from Virginia using standardized tests in the United States found a 43% drop in students reaching proficiency. Now, when we look at low and middle income countries, This isn't all the data we have to date, but this is much of it. So work from Sao Paulo, Brazil shows standardized test scores dropping by a third of a standard deviation, with girls losing more relative to boys. Now, if you don't have an intuition for standard deviations, which I don't blame you if you don't, depending on the study, various people have tried to calculate, well, how much of learning does a student usually learn in a year, right? And I've done some work on this with Fei Yuan. Abhijit Singh has done some work on this. Depending on the country, depending on the method you use, 0.32 standard deviations is something between 6 months and a year of learning. So it's, schools were closed and students weren't learning. So in Ghana, we see a drop of 0.2 or 0.3 standard deviations. Specifically, that's the increase in the gap between poorer and richer students. So once again, the most prominent impacts felt by the most vulnerable. In rural Kenya, some estimates of a 3.5 month loss in math skills. And in India, comparing student test scores to student performance on, previously on tests administered within the census or in the ASER, find between a 17% drop in urban areas and a 25% drop in rural areas in literacy outcomes. So these are big literacy impacts. So we're going to talk in the course of this event a little bit about what people should be doing, like what we should do to remedy this. And I think it's important for us to think about financing, because a lot of the stuff that we want to do costs money. So as of early this year, which is the latest data I've seen on education budgets, far more low and lower middle income countries have reduced their education budgets relative to higher and upper middle income countries. And that's what we see in the pair of pie charts on the right. So about 2/3 of lower income countries had cut their education budgets, whereas only about 1/3 of higher income countries. And on average, budgets for education have tended to continue growing faster in higher income countries. And so we see inequality increasing. If we look at the past, a big recession in the past, the global financial crisis about 12 years ago, we see a big drop in spending, especially in lower middle income countries. And what we also see is that aid flows for education grew stagnant. They basically haven't grown much at all since then. And so that's a poor and inauspicious indicator for what we might expect going forward. Okay, so I'll just wrap it up with a few ideas of what might need to happen next in terms of achieving, bringing kids back up to speed. So one is targeted outreach to non-returners. So we have, again, depending on the country, between 7, 10, 15% of students who aren't returning to school. And education systems and communities and schools need to work together to make sure that as many as possible of those students come back. So I haven't seen a lot of evidence on these kinds of outreach programs, but I have seen we have a fair amount of evidence that informational outreach can be effective when we reach out to parents by text message or by phone and either remind them of the returns to education, remind them that their students are missing school. These can have big impacts we've seen outside of the pandemic. And so that's one area to invest. The second is differentiated instruction. What sometimes, one brand of this is called teaching at the right level. So this is something, there's a large body of work that's been developed over the last decade. And what the pandemic does is heightens the need to make sure that we are reaching every student at the level that they are. A lot of students you have students at grades 1 through 6 reading levels, all within a 6th grade class. And providing teachers and teachers' aides with tools to make sure every student is getting instruction at the level they're at right now is the only way, especially to help those students who are far behind, to succeed. A third is continuing financing. So there are going to be a lot of demands on the budgets in coming years. We've already seen a little bit of evidence on that. And so part of this is almost is a policy activist element, which is that, if we don't maintain education financing, if we allow that to get slashed, then we won't be able to invest in the programs we need for human and capital accumulation for the next generation. And the last thing I'll say is tech that helps all students. So this is not the last time that schools will close. Hopefully not again for COVID, although I don't know, but also schools will close for teacher strikes, for other reasons. There are a lot of countries where widespread universal internet access is not going to be the case for the next 5, 10, 15 years. And so in those countries, we need to make sure that we invest in the quality of low-tech interventions. So how can radio and television instruction be more effective? How can outreach from teachers to students via the phone and other methods be more effective than they have been during the COVID crisis? So those are a few ideas to get us going. Now I'm going to pass it over to Mpumi, who is going to talk to us about the South Africa experience.
Great. As I've been introduced, my name is Nompumelelo Mohohlwane. I am from the Department of Basic Education, working in the Research Monitoring and Evaluation section. A lot of what I'm presenting is based on what we have been doing and how we've been responding to the COVID pandemic through various data collections that have included collaborations between the National Ministry of Education as well as what we're calling the NITSCRAM survey. So a longitudinal survey that's been happening across the country for the past 20 years, but has now had a Corona rapid version of it. Maybe to just start off with some context. So the schooling context in South Africa is that 13 million children are in school, and children make up about 22% of South Africa's population. Of all those children, 95% of them are in the public schooling system, and only 5% are in private schools. And I think in the case of South Africa, this is quite different from what you see in the rest of the continent. So worth mentioning and worth holding as I take you through this presentation. And then further, we classify the schools in South Africa into quintiles. So this is based on school socioeconomic status. The majority of schools, about 75%, are classified as quintile 1 to 3. This means that there are no fee charging schools, and only the 15%, 25%, including the private schools, are fee charging. Getting back into COVID then, what happened in 2020? What you're seeing there is a version of a calendar from school closures in 2020. We had a national school closure announcement 18th of March, and we closed until May. That is the longest unplanned timeframe schools have been closed for since 1994, so since democracy in South Africa. We then had a phased reopening by grade from June, and as you can see here, you're seeing we prioritized exit grades. So our schooling system is grade R to 7. The grade 7 learners came back to school along with the school leaving grade, which is grade 12. They came back first, and that kept getting staggered with the last grades to return as grade 5 and grade 8. And so if you're estimating lost learning days, we lost up to 196 days of the planned calendar year. So of the planned 2020 year, 196 days or 60% of the schooling year did not in fact happen. And if you then try and estimate what the maximum number of schooling days was by 2 grades, for grade 2, we lost 127 grades. But if you take, that's the first part. If you look at grade 4, we lost 131 days. What I haven't mentioned so far, though, is because of overcrowding and large class sizes, most schools in the public sector, so that's 75% that I've categorized as quintile 1 to 3, implemented what is called rotational attendance. And this played out in different formats. For most schools, it meant that children were attending every alternate day. And so if you take that into account, once schools were open for these 2 grades I'm illustrating with, we then had a maximum of 40% of schooling at the grade 2 level and 44% of schooling at the grade 4 level. So yeah, just double clicking on that a little bit to understand it a bit more. What happened when we opened schools in the staggered way, so that initial reopening where specific grades were prioritized. This graph shows you estimated weekly attendance. This is a nationally representative survey where parents were asked or guardians or adults in the household were asked, was your child at school in this past week? And in the green, you're seeing what were open grades, so the grades that were expected to be returning. And then what you're seeing in blue is the closed grades. So the reason closed grades could be open is schools could appeal and write an application with motivation for why they want to open more grades than the first phased reopening as planned or initiated by government. And the main reason schools are allowed to do this is the phased reopening is essentially trying to address COVID social distancing within classrooms especially. So if you are a large, wealthy school, you have more space than the quintile 1 to 3 schools, and therefore there's no reason for you to not open. And if you take that into mind, you can then see that the top 10% were more than twice as likely to be open for the closed grades than poorer schools. Then by November, when all schools were allowed to be open, this inequality was addressed because everyone was now allowed to be at school. So big point here is that by phasing reopening, the result was in fact privileging schools that were wealthier. Then what happened in 2021? So we had firstly a full return. We continued with rotational attendance and had a full return to school announced from July this year. But we know that 73% of quintile 1 to 2 schools have large class sizes that exceed 45 learners within a class, whereas the richest quintile has only 17% of the same problem. And so you can imagine that while schools are allowed to be fully back, fully in attendance, in reality, if we're going to maintain in-classroom social distancing, then this is not going to be feasible for the majority of schools. So if we try and calculate lost teaching days this year, thankfully there were minimum disruptions. So we had 2 weeks of a delay in February. We had an early closure in June, and so we're estimating that is about 19 days. But like I mentioned earlier, and as we see here with the large class sizes, if the same logic holds for why we have rotational attendance, by July, none of that had changed. And therefore, we are expecting that by July, 50% of the school year had been lost. And then there's a question that remains about the last part of the year. When we were measuring attendance in terms of the NISCRAM survey I mentioned earlier, attendance improved drastically. We went from attendance in July that was different depending on grade to about 94% attendance in April this year. We did experience some non-attendance, and Dave started pointing to this in what he was presenting, including for South Africa. So according to our data in the NISCRAM survey, what we saw in April, well, historically in the past, South Africa from 2002 has had near universal attendance for compulsory schooling. So 7 to 17 years, about 98% of children were attending. When asked in the NISCRAM survey, was your child in school over the last 2 weeks, we saw changes between November and April this year. With about 10% of adults reporting that at least one learner in their household had not returned to school. While this is still well above the 90s, it's drastic in our case. And if you use our general household data estimations of what that 2% meant when we were at 98%, and therefore what the 6% means now that we're at 94%, this showed that our estimates were then that between 230 and 500,000 more children were not at school in April this year compared to in the past. Thankfully, administrative data that, yes, does not focus on attendance and focuses on enrollment does not confirm the same. So what we saw when comparing enrollment from the first term in 2020 and 2021, we saw that about 19,000 children, or less than 0.4%, had dropped out or were not seen in the data. So children between 7 and 15, which are our compulsory years of schooling. But even more interestingly is that we saw about a 2% delay in those that were coming to school for the first time. And so to conclude this slide on learner dropout, we did not in fact see the drastic simulations or estimations that came from the NISCRAM survey or that we were anticipating in general. We are in fact seeing very little dropout, but maybe some more delay in terms of starting school for the first time. Just speaking a little bit on rotation, this is based on one province in the country. We have 9 provinces. But when teachers were asked how many days they were teaching the same learners, so what version of rotational attendance they were implementing, the majority of schools were implementing the alternate day model. So children were at school for 3 days one week and 2 days in the other week at 45%. And if you add that to even less than that, you're getting almost 60% of children that are at school at best for 3 days in a week. And so that remains as a big concern. While we say we've returned to school, how many days are children actually getting for schooling? But we also recognize that parents or guardians are a big part of the schooling conversation, especially now. I think parents have more autonomy than they have ever had about their children returning to school, especially in the case of South Africa, where, like I explained, most children are in the public schooling system. When parents were asked how worried they were about their children returning to school, we see drastic numbers, so about 75% worried in July last year, with a massive decline to about 45% this year. This has also been mapped against changes in lockdown restrictions. So we've been at full lockdown, starting where I showed you in terms of the schooling systems, all schools shut down, to schools being open, with business and other parts of the economy being partially open or closed. And with all of those changes, you see that mirror the levels of worry amongst parents. Then turning to learning losses, a lot of people have thought about technology as the answer, but what is the context here in South Africa? Dave also spoke a bit about this. So we have in South Africa produced multimedia school content on the 3 SABC TV channels. These are the public broadcaster channels, as well as 13 radio stations. Again, these are public radio stations, so high coverage across the country. So quite stable, quite accessible. And even when we think about satellite TV, which is what we have as DSTV or OpenView broadcast services, we saw quite a lot of those broadcasting education content. And we even saw cell phone companies coming to the party with 0 rated websites, especially for education content websites. But taking this into a specific context, we saw in the best case scenario that the scheduling for broadcasting education content was a maximum of 3.5 hours per day. And this often focused on the school leaving phase, so the further education and training phase. This is, of course, much less than what the average school day would be amongst children. And I think I remember seeing the foundation phase grade 1 lessons playing at 9 o'clock in the evening. So the chances that children are watching this are, of course, highly unlikely for the majority. And like I'm saying, even when content is broadcasted across these channels, it's a fraction of what a typical school day would be. And then turning to household surveys, 25% of children in South Africa do not even have TV or internet access. So even in the best case scenario where we had 24-hour broadcasts, there's a quarter of children who would not be accessing this content. Furthermore, 8% of households have children with internet access. For most people in South Africa, internet access is maybe with a smartphone, but also at their workplace. So as soon as we took away the workplace component with lockdowns, the idea that internet would be how we reach children did not hold. And if you think about who, in fact, then accesses technology, who is geared for online learning, so someone with their own laptop, secure and constant internet access, as well as the resources and data to run this, we would say that only the wealthiest 5% of schools have near universal computer access and would, in fact, be able to engage in what would be fully remote learning. And so with that in mind, we have several research studies, reading studies. We've been tracking the same learners using very similar assessments, assessing them in the foundation phase. And the big takeaway here is in a typical province that is a quintile 1 to 3 province. So schools that are very typical of the average South African school, we saw about 75% of learning losses in reading. In grade 4, this is amongst children who have been learning in this language, home language, for 3 years and have transitioned to a different language. We see a similar pattern of 50% of learning losses in English, which is their first additional language. The same was confirmed for lower grades in the case of a different province, which is Eastern Cape. The main takeaway point here is that we're seeing losses of 75% in home language, to summarize, and about 50% in English, which is their first additional language. So we are very concerned about the changes in trajectories of learning and what's happening amongst typical learners in the education system. Then closing off before the conclusion slide, teachers are a big part of the education system, and so we cannot be speaking about learners, learning, and parents without taking teachers into consideration. And so what this graph is showing you is teacher deaths that are related to the pandemic. We're classifying that as access deaths. So on average, about 5 teachers die a day. And what you're seeing with the purple line is pre-pandemic deaths. So about 5% of daily deaths over time. What you're seeing with the green line is pandemic-related deaths. And the summary version here is that we have, in fact, experienced death amongst teachers. And these access deaths are being attributed to COVID-19 related infections or COVID-19 directly. But a big takeaway in this case is that the peaks in the wave, in the teacher deaths, are related to COVID peaks. So these are related to waves, peaks in the COVID-related waves, and they are not in any way related to the school term. In fact, in December and January, where we had the highest deaths, is when schools were fully closed. Schools closed early January and opened at the end of early December and opened at the end of January. And so the Pediatric Association of South Africa, as well as others, have been saying schools are not posing a particular threat to teachers, and therefore school closures are an inefficient way of addressing COVID risk. And then finally, our recommendations here are that attendance needs to go back to normal. Before we are talking about building back better or recovery, as long as we're having the majority of children not fully at school on a day-to-day basis, we are continuing to compound the learning losses and not starting to address them. And as I explained, remote learning is not a viable option in South Africa, and I doubt it is for most places in developing contexts. And while parents are concerned, it's not that parents are concerned and they're saying schools should close. Parents are concerned, but they are allowing their children to go to school. We are concerned about long-term learning losses. So while, as I showed, current learner dropout is not significant, we still argue that the biggest long-term cause for dropout are weak learning foundations. And if we continue to have these learning losses, we will in fact see learner dropouts, not now while we're watching, but in 5 or 6 or 7 years, as has been the case in South Africa historically. Schools don't pose a specific risk to teachers. And I didn't show this, but teachers were given a special vaccine drive in the context of South Africa. And the last stats for that were showing that about 80% of teachers are vaccinated. And with all of that context, children are not at a specific risk through going to school. And we should therefore do everything possible to get children back at school on a permanent basis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these 2 wonderful presentations, Dev and Vupumi. I wish the news were a little bit more upbeat. You've shown us pretty drastic learning losses in a number of contexts, and especially your last figure, Vupumi, was really striking. So let me start now the discussion. Please use the Q&A box to add questions if you have any. And I'll start with some asking you, Mpumi, to react to Dave's recommendations at the end. He said, what needs to happen next? And if my notes are correct, he mentioned targeted outreach to non-returners, which seems to be, the good news there that non-returners are fewer than everybody thought. So it seems like this may be like the least concerning, at least compared to expectation of issues. But then the other big thing that they've mentioned was differentiated instruction to deal with the fact that, as you've shown, this learning loss is very heterogeneous. The richest kids were able to benefit from schools that were open mode due to waivers, better technology. So how do we help with that? To have more teachers or more teacher aides, you also need more financing. Dave showed us that financing is going down. And so how do you think of all of that going forward? What would be the one thing you would do, Mpumi, tomorrow if you were the Minister of Education? And do you agree with these recommendations from Dave?
Yeah, so you raise a very good question. In the context of developing countries in South Africa, children were already struggling, right? So we're already having learning deficits. And now, like you're mentioning, we have an even more diverse ability classroom. And so I think a key enabler or tool to empower teachers would firstly be allowing them or providing them with tools to diagnose this. So to be able to level everyone, where is everyone? Do they have a 3-group participation classroom, or are there 5 categories of participation? So I think that's an important thing, that we're all using the same tool consistently on day one. That's what's happening. And then I would say what the next step would be providing teachers with a differentiated curriculum. So we cannot continue with business as usual, as though nothing's happened. So we can call it a trim curriculum. We can speak about core skills, etc. And this would be an overall approach, right? So it's still uniform in some ways. It's still for the whole classroom, but it is trimmed from pre-COVID. And then even within that, I would then say you want to pick what are your 2 core skills in reading or in the early subjects, and then provide even more resources for those 2. So we're not going to be able to effectively deliver personalized education for everyone, but if you can know where your children are, have a reduced curriculum in general, and then be helped to target for those, even if it's into 2 categories, what should you be teaching with your children that are, say, at level 1 and 2, whatever that means, versus your children that are on track? I think that would be a good place to start.
All right. And thank you so much. Another question this time, for maybe for Dave to start. You mentioned it is very important to make sure that we have tech that helps all students, and I'm thinking about this being all the more important in the event of another pandemic. Let's say in the next decade happening. How do we make sure that we are prepared so that the next time we need to close schools for an extended period of time, we don't end up seeing the type of scrambling around and losses that we saw this time? Do you have some clues as to which way the tech world should go? What we have a whole bunch of creative minds around here in Silicon Valley. Can you give them pointers as to where to put their energy so that we come up with the right technologies?
That's a great question, and I'll just throw out a couple of thoughts on that. I think one is that, there's, if you look at the international organizations, the World Bank and elsewhere, there's a, big push for sort of, universal connectivity. And I think it's important to reiterate that it's just not an immediate, so it's great. I mean, countries should continue investing in broad connectivity because there are a lot of economic and other benefits of that, right? But as a primarily education intervention, I think especially in lower income environments, it's just that's a very long-term investment, and it's not going to help us when schools have to close next year or even 2 or 3 years from now. And so what I think this means are 2 things. One is, a lot of the desire is to invest in technologies that are, that use the best technology. And so, interactive learning via the, internet or things, smartphones. And there's just so little access That said, we've come a long way from when, in the 1970s and 80s, people were testing radio instruction. There's a lot more you could do with these simple technologies in terms of complementing radio and TV instruction with, interactive access where teachers or even, teachers' aides, like people with minimal training, are reaching out to students and nudging and encouraging. Now, we're going to learn a lot. We're going to continue learning a lot from this pandemic. There's a lot of ongoing research about what's worked and what hasn't in terms of distance instruction. But I think the other thing that we need to be doing is taking advantage as we go forward of places like times like school holidays and school vacations to keep testing what works to reach the lowest income students, the rural students. Like we already know, we have evidence from high income countries and low income countries that those students lose a lot over the course of school holidays. And it's a perfect opportunity for us to both invest in stemming that learning loss and testing the kinds of complements to simple technological interventions that might work the next time we have a big school shutdown.
Okay. You want to add something? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with what Dave was saying, especially around like when we're thinking of technology, to not be benchmarking it against the best possible scenario, right? So like I was saying, in our case, if most people don't have access to technology, benchmarking it on middle income households, middle class, with uninterrupted fiber is unrealistic. You are then designing for the 5%. You're not designing for the 70%. So I think that's an important context switch that we need to apply when we're going from the global north to the global south in general. But I also think that the pandemic highlighted for me what has been problematic in maybe two ways. One is we have been speaking a lot about devices. So I guess what is called the bad buy. So just hardware in people's hands. And not enough about the content of that hardware. So, okay, I now have a smartphone, but what am I supposed to do with it? And I'm hoping that we, as much as infrastructure and all of that, of course, you need that to even be able to get your software to anyone. But I don't think enough of us are spending our time thinking about how to translate the existing curriculum into software programs at a low cost. And I think in the case of South Africa, in 11 languages, maybe South Africa is even like that's not as much as other countries. And so I'm hoping that that's been elevated. And then maybe a final one is thinking of the education system in a blanket way. I think the real opportunity for leveraging technology is, in fact, with the near school leaving phases. So children that are a year or two away from graduating and joining university have in fact mastered the basic skills of reading and counting. We're now focusing in some ways on content, right? So you want them to learn about other countries, about history or society or other subjects. There's a lot more you can do with those children than what you can do using technology for maybe people who are learning English for the first time in grade 4, switching grades. And so I think that differentiated approach may also help us think through what is feasible for what age category or what grade.
So can I react to that? Because actually I was just thinking about the way technology is used, for example, in some of the public schools here in Palo Alto where my kids go. And there's a lot of differentiated learning that happens through the technology. So these apps that are very simple that a first grader, even a kindergartner can use, that like keeps track of where they are. And so we just talked about differentiated instruction being so important, not only to cope with the consequences of the learning loss being differential during the crisis, but also the fact that to start with there are very heterogeneous levels. So if we are going to have to do differential instruction going forward, not just from for recovery, and that was one of the questions of the audience. Like, isn't there a need to make sure that we find ways to bring this low-tech technologies even to these lower levels, not just like for content at the higher level? Because it seems like that's a great way to help the teachers. Once they've done, the diagnostic tools themselves can be done through tech, and then helping the students go through at their own pace, where you have only one or two teachers in the classroom. So I see the challenge of having this in 11 languages, but it seems like that's where the wind is blowing.
So absolutely. I mean, in a perfect world, if I didn't know our context, I would say that. I'd say let's just use technology. It's adaptive to children, etc., to differentiate, to support, etc. But we did this so accelerated programs about 5 or 7 years ago. What industries could we accelerate development in to set us up for the next while? So sort of looking forward as a country. And the education budget in terms of technology, just getting the infrastructure done, was the full teacher budget. So we should not pay teachers, and we can do technology if that's what we want. And that's not even a year's spending. That was like 5 years of the teacher salary budget, which is 80% of where all our money goes. So there's the reality of trade-offs. We need to choose trade-offs. And for me, what government struggles with often is prioritizing, right? So it's like all or nothing. So I'd say if we're prioritizing and we have limited resources, let's first do the phase where the children are independent. You can give them a tablet to take home. They can be self-directed learning, especially if we're talking about future closures. Whereas for me, grade 1 to 3 learners, if we're speaking about future closures, would need parents who are working with them, who help them access the technology, etc. Of course, important in the 10-year plan, but I would say the 3-year or 1-year plan, if you said, here's $1 billion, and we want to use it in technology, we're making a choice that it must go to technology. Where do we put it? I would say to the school leaving phase. So the last 3 years before they exit, they can be self-directed, and then we can develop software and then institute that amongst lower grades.
You want to react to that, Dave?
I'll just add, I agree with what Mpumi said. I do think, obviously we have to think about, where there's low-hanging fruit, I think there's real value in that. So we do have evidence from high-income countries, not just in North America, but also in Chile, that, for example, that you can do a lot with, texting parents and reminding them to help their students with things, to get, if their students have missed assignments and this sort of thing. That can be really useful. I think one of the things that we have to think about, though, is that even those kinds of technological interventions, what they do is they favor the parents who have the time and the bandwidth to help their kids do their homework and to get them to school. Now, if those are low-cost interventions and we can help, because in a lot of contexts, most kids are struggling, and so even if you're helping kids who are not the very worst off, you're still helping kids who are struggling. So that's fine if that's low cost. But I think, like Mpumi says, when we think about prioritization, and when I was working in World Bank operations, I found that the exact experience that Mpumi describes, which is that countries often have and international organizations as well, either a 0 or a 60 miles an hour sort of attitude towards technology. Like we're either doing everything, we're giving a laptop to every kid, or not. And if we have to choose between those two extremes, I think that the place we have to invest is in what can work in low-income environments in the short run.
Okay, so since we are, almost running out of time already, I want to take a step back and ask Mpumi to tell us the extent to which some of the work that folks, like our affiliates at the King Center or Dave and his colleagues at the, initially at the World Bank and now the CGD are doing, how helpful is that when you think about decisions that have to be made, locally? A lot of reports come out saying these are the best buys and this is what you should do, and it tend to have a one-size-fits-all flavor. So we had some questions from the audience coming from our colleagues over at the Stanford Impact Labs, asking, well, is that really the type of information that you need, or is it always too general to be useful? And if I may ask a secondary question to that, what do you need most? Like, how can all the researchers very interested in helping improve education outcomes around the world be the most helpful compared to what you are already able to do with your units with the very data that matters?
Good questions. So I think actually the Best Buy's work, those categorizations have been in fact very helpful, and they are in fact very specific. It's very clear. The information aspect helps. So I know a year or two we had Stats SA making errors about the levels of education that are current versus 20 years ago. So that kind of messaging to parents, which are categorized as Best Buys, right? So there's information about returns to education that you can just make publicly available. Found that incredibly useful. Similarly with the Good Buys, it does help as a ministry or as government to speak about international evidence and apply it to developing country context. So both thinking through the rationale, the theory, the implementation aspect, and then finding the evidence that matches a similar context, extremely useful. And then I think even the bad buys, to say, the best thinking in the world is not about buying hard drives. It really helps make the case. And I think if you asked us 3-4 years ago, we're probably working on getting tablets in every child's hand. If you ask us now, we'll be like, yeah, we think tablets matter, but maybe we should get the reading interventions bedded down. What I do think is maybe what I think you have as promising but low evidence buys, or even bad buys, those are the ones where I think some of them need more framing. So things like just reducing classrooms is not helpful, I think can be a problematic statement if you're speaking about going from 25 to 20 in a classroom. When I speak about classrooms, I'm speaking about 45 to 30, massive difference. And for a teacher who's supposed to do individualized reading, etc., that kind of thing would be helpful. But if someone else presents this and says, no, the World Bank said it's a bad buy, yeah, kind of problematic. So with things like that, I'd say some caveats would help. The ones that need evidence, I think, make sense, especially. And maybe a final aspect would be, for me, when there are buzzwords like 21st century skills or the fourth industrial revolution, it would be especially helpful if international donors, funders, researchers unpack what that is, because we very quickly gravitate towards those things, coding and robotics, when we're still arguing that we can't count and we can't read. And so we will definitely not be able to program. So almost making it like a hierarchy. You need to do this, then you can code. But it can serve as a distraction where we spend all of our time just arguing about what the fourth industrial revolution is.
Well, thank you so much for this very powerful and direct words. It's super helpful. I would love to give Dave 10 seconds to say a few closing remarks, and then to get back to you, for me, to close us off, and then we have to call it a day. But it's been so wonderful to have you both. Dave, 10 seconds.
Thanks so much, Pascaline, and I'm sorry, obviously we didn't have time to get to all the questions. I'll just say things like these global recommendations, smart buys, best buys, should always be the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation. And that's especially true in countries where you don't have as many qualified educational researchers, like a strong core in lower income environments. It's important to have that just be the beginning and understand what's going to work in context and test new things and try new things and see how they work, because this is still an ongoing learning process. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
And I guess from me to say, there was a question earlier on curriculum reform. In Kenya especially, and thoughts about that, and it links to what Dave is saying, curriculum reform and prioritizing specific skills, while important, should always be done carefully and slowly in developing country context. It has the potential to undermine everything that you have achieved. And so I'd encourage all of us to, even when we critique what's happening in the education system, to do it thoughtfully, to not provoke radical responses that in fact take us backwards. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. It's been so wonderful to hear about your thoughts and to get your expert view today. We really enjoyed having you. And thank you all for attending. The recording will be posted on our website. And we hope to see you on Tuesday, November 2nd for our speaker series with Professor Penny Goldberg, who will discuss supply chain disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you again for attending. Have a great day.